The forest was dark, shadows danced between the trees, the ground was covered in soft moss. It was very quiet, only the whisper of the wind could be heard. This was the home of Nib. Nib was not a fairy or a gnome. Nib was a grimp. He was tiny, no bigger than your thumb. He had big eyes and even bigger courage. Nib lived in a village hidden under the roots of a giant oak tree. Life was peaceful until the day the Heartstone disappeared. The Heartstone was a magical stone that protected the Grimps. Without it, they were in danger. Nib knew he had to find the Heartstone. It was a dangerous mission, but Nib was brave. He would face any danger to save his village.
I promised to return with the Heartstone.
Nib packed a small bag. He took a piece of cheese, a shiny pebble, and a long strand of spider silk. He said goodbye to his family. He promised to return with the Heartstone. He slipped out of the village and into the forest. The giant oak tree loomed above him. He felt very small, but he was determined. He knew what he had to do. He had heard stories about giants living beyond the Whispering Woods. Legend said they had taken the Heartstone. Nib knew he had to find them. He started his journey, his small footsteps barely making a sound on the mossy ground. The forest was filled with strange sounds. Nib ignored them. He was scared, but he had to be brave. He was on a mission to save his people. After what felt like days, Nib came to a clearing. There he saw huge footprints in the ground. They were bigger than he was. This must be where the giants lived. Nib felt a shiver of fear, but he kept going. He had to be brave. He had to find the Heartstone. He followed the footprints, careful not to be seen. He saw giant houses made of trees and rocks. He saw giant tables and chairs. Everything was gigantic. Nib had to be very careful not to be stepped on. Then he saw it. In the middle of the village was a giant castle. It was made of stone and had tall towers. Nib knew the Heartstone had to be inside. The castle gate was open. Nib took a deep breath and went inside. The castle was dark and gloomy. Huge cobwebs hung from the ceiling. Nib felt very small. He crept down long corridors. He peeked into giant rooms. He was looking for anything that looked like a Heartstone, but he couldn't find it. Where could it be? He came to a massive door. It was slightly ajar. Nib peeked inside. The room was a giant's bedroom. There was a huge bed with fur blankets and pillows the size of Nib's house, and then he saw it. On a giant's nightstand, beside a half-eaten giant turkey leg, was the Heartstone. It glowed with a soft, warm light. Nib was about to grab the Heartstone when he heard a purr. It was a deep, rumbling purr.
Oh no.
Nib froze. He turned around slowly. Sitting on the giant's bed was a cat, but this was no ordinary cat. It was the size of a bear with sharp claws and teeth. The cat stared at Nib with big yellow eyes.
I have to be clever.
He grabbed a spool of thread from the floor and started to push it. The spool rolled towards the cat, unwinding the thread as it went. The cat watched the spool with curious eyes. It batted at the thread with its paw. The cat was distracted.
Now's my chance. Nib dashed to the nightstand while the cat was busy playing. He grabbed the Heartstone. It was warm in his hands. He quickly stuffed it into his bag. He ran out of the room as fast as his little legs could carry him. He heard the cat jump down from the bed and hiss. Nib didn't look back. He had to escape. He dodged giant furniture and ran down long corridors. He squeezed under doors and jumped over cracks in the floor. He finally reached the castle gate and ran outside. He was free. Nib ran and ran until he couldn't run anymore. He collapsed on the ground, exhausted but relieved. He had the Heartstone. He had done it.
As Nib lay there catching his breath, he heard a booming voice.
Well, hello there, little one.
Nib looked up. Standing over him was a giant. He was the biggest giant Nib had ever seen. He had a bushy beard and kind eyes. Nib was terrified. He thought the giant would be angry with him for stealing the Heartstone, but the giant just smiled. He gently picked up Nib and placed him on his large palm.
What are you doing so far from home, little one?
His voice was deep and rumbling, but it was also kind. Nib took a deep breath and told the giant everything. He told him about the Grimps and the Heartstone. He told him how he had braved the forest and the giant's castle to get it back. The giant listened patiently. When Nib was finished, the giant smiled.
You are a brave little creature. You risked your life to save your people.
The giant looked down at the Heartstone in Nib's hand.
This does not belong to me, it belongs to you and your people. You should keep it safe.
The giant gently lowered Nib to the ground.
Be careful on your way home, little one.
And with that he turned and walked away. Nib watched him go, his heart filled with gratitude. He couldn't believe how lucky he was to have met such a kind giant. He knew he would never forget him. He clutched the heartstone tightly and started his journey home. Nib's journey back to the village was much easier. The forest didn't seem as dark or scary anymore. He knew that even though he was small, he could be brave.
When he reached the village, everyone cheered. They had been so worried.
Nib held up the heartstone and the village erupted in celebration. Nib was a hero. He had faced his fears and outsmarted a giant cat. He had even met a friendly giant. Most importantly, he had saved his village. Nib had learned a valuable lesson that day. Even the smallest creature can make a big difference.
Hooray for Nib, our hero!